The summary channel, and in this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. The Russians carry out another massive missile and drone attack across Ukraine between the 9th and the 10th of October of 2025, and the sources are saying that that was the biggest attack carried out by Russia, but most likely the sources were trying to tell us that that was the most powerful attack because Russians didn't attack military objects, they didn't attack warehouses or ammo depots. At least we haven't received anything that can confirm this. The sources are saying that the main Russian focus was energy infrastructure, and as a result of this attack, the Ukrainians and Ukraine itself suffered huge losses. So the explosions were recorded in the Odessa region, and the sources are saying that there was a blackout in this area. Furthermore, Russians attacked the city of Zaporozhye. The sources are saying that a critical infrastructure facility in Zaporozhye has been attacked. According to available reports, a power facility is on fire. Furthermore, the Russians attacked the city of Dnipro. We have some videos and some pictures from this area. A massive attack is underway on Ukrainian targets in Dnipropetrovsk after a series of strikes. Power outages began in Dnipropetrovsk and Kryvyi Rog. So in these videos we can see explosions across the city of Dnipro. Furthermore, the sources are saying that the Russians attacked power plants along the river of Dnipro. Kremenchuk and Kanyev hydroelectric power stations are under massive attack. And the biggest attack the Russians carry out on the city of Kiev. As for this territory, we got lots of important updates, so let's discuss them in details. The Ukrainians are saying that as a result of attack, the Kiev has become without power. Kiev is without power. Water supply is disrupted through the Ukrainian capital. Video shows a blackout on both the right and left banks of the Kiev River after a massive attack on the combined heat and power plant. Due to the challenging power situation in Kiev, metro service on some lines is suspended. A new schedule is being introduced. Furthermore, the sources are saying that the situation was very difficult during the night, and this is exactly the moment when the Russians managed to destroy energy facility, and right after this we can see that the lights were turned off across the city. The moment the missile struck, plunging Kiev into darkness. So this information was confirmed by Mayor of Kiev, Klivchko. He confirmed that most of the capital was without power. There were also problems with water supply. You know that it is very difficult to live in Kiev if you don't have water or if you don't have electricity. Especially it concerns the eastern bank of the river of Dnipro. So as we discussed in the previous videos, most likely the Russians are trying to make the situation when it is going to be impossible to live at least in the eastern and the northeastern part of Ukraine, and this can force Ukrainians to launch another wave of immigration. Ukrainians will leave the eastern part of Ukraine towards the western part, and this situation can lead to complete collapse of defense, because if, let's say, Ukrainians from the eastern part, due to blackout or power outages, decide to leave this part of Ukraine in the western direction, then there's going to be a huge gap, let's say, between the river of Dnipro and the line of combat contact and the border between Russia and Ukraine, completely without populated area. And of course, Ukrainian soldiers along the line of combat contact will not be able to hold their positions with this gap, because they need food, they need some services, they need transport, they need everything, let's say, to carry out their service along the line of combat contact and fight with Russians. So this is the situation. So this morning the pro-Ukraine resources published this picture where we can see the approximate routes of Russian attack. As you can see, Russians were using hundreds of drones. As usually, Russians were using ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles and cruise missiles. As you can see, lots of explosions were recorded in the area of the city of Kiev, in the area of the settlement of Kani. As we discussed, the power plant was damaged. The settlement of Kremenchuk, another power plant, was damaged, and the cities of Dnipro and Zaporozhye also. Power plants and energy infrastructure were damaged and maybe destroyed on the territory of these two cities. The situation is very difficult for Ukraine. Later, we got this article that was also published by pro-Ukraine resources, and according to this article, during the previous 12 hours, the Ukrainians managed to bring down 405 drones out of 465 drones that were launched by Russia. Furthermore, the Ukrainians managed to bring down 15 missiles out of 32 missiles. So in total, the Russians used up to 500 air vehicles to attack territory Ukraine. Once again, that wasn't the biggest attack from the Russian side when talking about numbers, about number of drones and missiles, but according to damage that the Russians managed to deal, that was the biggest attack. Furthermore, today pro-Ukraine resources reported that in 2022, at the beginning of the special military operation, on the 10th of October of 2022, the Russians, for the first time, launched their attacks on energy and facility of Ukraine. So this is something like anniversary from Russian side. So the first attack against Ukraine energy facilities took place on the 10th of October of 2022. And today the Russians probably, I don't know how to call the situation, attack once again. And that was, as we can see, the biggest attack, the most powerful attack. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction where Russians continue their offensive operation. And during the previous 12 hours, changes on the ground were recorded on the territory of Poltavka. So let's compare the maps before we continue. So according to information we have, as you can see, Russians secured the territory along the river of Yanchul by taking under control additional positions, but there is very important change in the central part of the settlement of Poltavka. So for example, by the 9th of October of 2025, the central part of the settlement of Poltavka used to be considered as a gray zone, because if you remember, several days ago, some pro-Russian resources reported that Russians managed to cross the river of Yanchul and to establish control over this territory. But today, on the 10th of October of 2025, we got this video that was published by pro-Russian resources, and here we can see how Russians were bombing the central part of Poltavka, exactly this area that used to be considered as a gray zone. So based on this video, we came to the conclusion that maybe Russians crossed the river of Yanchul, maybe they were trying to establish their foothold there, but most likely under the pressure of the armed forces of Ukraine, the Russians at the end were forced to fall back to the eastern part of the settlement. So that is why we have restored control over the central part of Poltavka in Ukrainian favor. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the northern flank of the offensive operation of the group of forces east in the area of responsibilities of the 29th Army. Today we got report, and today we got this video published by Ukrainian resources, and here we can see how Ukrainians were attacking positions of the armed force of the Russian Federation in the southern part of the settlement of Alexeyevka. So this is exactly the moment, and this is exactly what the pro-Ukraine resources were talking about when they were coloring this area as a contested area. If you remember, pro-Ukraine resources draw some polygon, let's say from the settlement of Verbova towards the village of Alexeyevka. They were showing that Russians managed to capture farms, and today we got a proof. So here we can see exactly how the situation was taking place. Here we can see Ukrainian tank in the top left corner, and most likely these farms were under control of Russian soldiers, and Ukrainian tank was attacking these positions. So based on this video, we have adjusted the map. We have colored the territory between the villages of Stepovo, Verbova, and Alexeyevka under complete Russian control. This is the situation by the end of the 9th of October of 2025, and this is the situation by the end of the 10th of October of 2025. The Russians managed to answer the village. Now the Russians are trying to improve their positions. As we discussed, the village of Alexeyevka is a very important village. If Russians can dig in deeper, they will be able to establish complete control with FPV drones over the river of Volcha, and they will not allow the Ukrainians to bring their forces to the south of the river with the purpose to counterattack. So Russians will be able to secure, and we're talking about huge amounts of territories. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction, where Russians continue their counter-offensive operation. Now it has become clear that Ukrainians most likely were completely defeated during their counter-attack, during their attempts to cut the area of breakthrough. Ukrainians started this counter-offensive operation in August of 2025, somewhere on the 12th of August of 2025, and during the previous 2 months where they were trying to cut this territory, The Ukrainians suffered huge losses and they haven't managed to get any result. Today we got report that the Russians continued their counterattacks, and as a result of Russian counterattacks, they managed to improve their position significantly. Basically, the Russians managed to restore complete control over the settlement by the name of Vladimirovka. So, by the way, this is the first village. This was the first village that was recaptured by Ukrainians during their counterattack in August, and so we see that everything returned to where it started. In this video, we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in this part of the settlement. Lots of episodes with FPV drones, how Ukrainians were attacking Russian vehicles, Russian infantry. So we have no doubt that the Russians are using here not just sabotage and reconnaissance group. The Russians use here vehicles, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles. So lots of very heavy armor. Furthermore, several mappers adjusted their maps, and according to all these updates, the settlement of Vladimirovka was completely recaptured by Russia. So now it's turn for the settlement of Shakhova, and if Ukrainians lose control over the settlement of Shakhova, they will lose control over the entire Shakhova pocket, and Russians will be able to continue further in the direction of the settlements of Toretsk and Sofievka. So these two villages are the last villages of the Shakhova pocket, and without the settlement of Shakhova itself, Ukrainians most likely will not be able to hold their positions for a very long period of time, because as we can see, the Russians are advancing in this direction also from the southeast. So and when Russians capture the entire Shakhova pocket, it seems that the Russians will continue offensive operation further in the direction of Drushkovka, and if they do this, if the Russians are going to do like this, then I'm not even sure what Ukrainians are going to do with the city of Konstantinovka, Alexeyevka, Drushkovka, because most likely these two cities would be caught by the Russians in cauldron or encircled, and Ukrainians would be forced to fall back. Because obviously for Russians it is much more easier to capture the settlement of Drushkovka than to capture the city of Konstantinovka, because this city is 4 or 5 times bigger. So less territory is smaller city, which means that less resources you need. But if Russians can capture this, we understand what is going to be next. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Rodinska. Today, several mappers reported that the Russians managed to dig in deeper in the northeastern part. Based on this report, we have adjusted the map by adding additional territories under complete Russian control. So now it's clear Ukrainians will not be able to force the Russians to fall back. Now the main task and priority for Ukrainians to find a solution how to slow down the Russians and not to allow them to break through the second defense belt, not to allow the Russians to answer the settlement of Drushkovka, so how to stop the Russians. But it seems that Syrsky, the chief of the general staff of the armed forces of Ukraine, currently doesn't have answer to this question. And that's it for the short video. Military with Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.